The unseen threat. The stars above the planet Gendera were quiet, the kind of quiet that was deceiving. Deep within the star systems of the galaxy, many species lived under the harsh reality of their dangerous worlds, where survival was not just a matter of food and shelter, but of constant warfare. These planets were known as death worlds. But none of these creatures ever expected to meet a species like humanity. Humanity had been exiled to a death world years ago. The aliens who had sent them there thought they were doing a favor to the galaxy. They believed the humans, being so different and weak in comparison to the mighty creatures that roamed the universe, would be a non-threat. The humans were stranded on Gendera, a planet that no one had dared approach in centuries. Its violent creatures, brutal weather, and vicious terrain were enough to keep anyone from coming close. But the aliens had made a terrible mistake. They didn't realize what they were dealing with when they thought of humanity as weak and primitive. They thought that these creatures would quickly be wiped out by the death world's dangers. What they didn't know was that humanity was different. They were survivors. They had been surviving for centuries, adapting and learning, fighting back when needed, and building their world from the ruins. It was on a regular day that the aliens decided to act. Their fleet arrived, sent to conquer and control the death world that humanity had called home. Their mission was simple: eliminate the humans, take control of the planet, and enslave whatever species might remain. They had faced countless challenges on other planets, dealing with monstrous creatures, intelligent life forms, and dangerous technologies. But the humans, they were nothing. Just another species to conquer, or so they thought. The alien fleet hovered above the planet's surface, its sleek ships like dark clouds in the sky. Thousands of soldiers, warriors from many different planets, all part of an advanced military force, stood ready. They were confident. They had no idea what they were about to face. On the ground, humans lived in relative peace in their small towns. They had built homes, farms, and defenses. But they had also learned the harsh realities of their world. The death world was unforgiving. Creatures that roamed the planet were far beyond anything the aliens had seen before. These creatures had evolved to survive in the harshest conditions, and so had humanity. They had learned to adapt, to fight, and most importantly, to survive. As the alien forces began their descent, the humans were unaware of the threat above. They had been through small skirmishes before, and the sudden appearance of ships in the sky was nothing new. They had dealt with invasions before, but never on this scale, and never from an enemy as arrogant as the one that had just arrived. The first strike came quickly. Alien ships fired from above, their weapons slicing through the air, creating massive explosions. The humans scrambled to protect themselves, but they were outmatched. The alien technology was far more advanced. The soldiers moved in quickly, their weapons disintegrating anything in their path. No one could stop them. But there was one thing the aliens hadn't anticipated. In their arrogance, they had not considered how humans would respond when pushed to the edge. The humans didn't run. They didn't hide. They fought back. Jack Carter, a mechanic by trade, was just an ordinary man. Or at least, he had been. When the aliens attacked, he was at his workshop, tinkering with an old vehicle. His leg was injured in the initial explosion that shook his building to the core. He could have stayed down, in pain, and waited for someone to rescue him. But Jack was not like that. He had survived on this death world for years, and he wasn't about to let an alien invasion take him down. Clutching his wrench, he crawled out of the wreckage, his injury throbbing with every movement. The air smelled of smoke and burning debris, but Jack's eyes were focused. He didn't care about the chaos around him. He had a job to do. The planet might be under attack, but he wasn't going to let it fall without a fight. From his vantage point, Jack could see the alien soldiers marching into the town. They moved like a well-oiled machine, confident in their superior strength. But Jack wasn't worried about them. No, he was worried about something else entirely, a creature from his past. a deadly, massive dragon-like creature that lived in the mountains just beyond the town's outskirts. For years, Jack had heard stories of these creatures, dragons, they called them. Terrifying, fire-breathing beasts that hunted anything in their path. Jack had never encountered one himself, but he had seen their footprints. And now, in this moment, Jack realized something the aliens had not. If he could trigger a response from the dragons, maybe he could turn the tide of the battle. The aliens were focused on wiping out humanity, but they didn't know about the monsters that roamed the land. Jack gritted his teeth, and despite the pain in his leg, began to move toward the mountains. If he could get the dragons to fight the aliens, it would give the humans a chance. But even as he made his way toward the mountain range, the aliens were continuing their attack. They didn't know what was coming for them. They didn't know that the Deathworlders had already learned the most important lesson: never underestimate humanity. And worse, never think you're alone. Because on this Deathworld, the true monster was just beginning to stir. As Jack limped along, his thoughts focused on one thing: survival. His injury didn't matter. The fight was just beginning. And humanity wasn't about to let the galaxy forget what they were capable of. The unlikely hero. The sounds of battle echoed through the air as the alien forces advanced through the town. Explosions rocked the earth beneath their boots, while laser fire and the chaotic clatter of weapons filled the sky. Alien soldiers, confident in their superior technology, moved through the streets with terrifying speed. Each one was equipped with advanced armor, energy shields, and weapons capable of reducing entire buildings to rubble. But despite the overwhelming power they wielded, there was a single human figure making his way toward the mountains. Jack Carter, injured but driven by a singular purpose, had already made his way far enough to disappear from the alien troop site. His leg, though wounded, was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility he carried. The aliens had no idea what kind of danger they had just unleashed, and Jack intended to make sure they never would. As he limped toward the mountain range, Jack's thoughts ran wild. He had been a mechanic before the war, fixing machines and vehicles in his small workshop, content with his life. But all of that had changed the moment humanity had been exiled to this planet. Gendara, a world so hostile that no other species had dared venture into its deadly terrain. They had called it a death world for a reason, and its challenges had been as much a part of humanity's survival as anything else. The creatures here were unforgiving. Massive predators, unpredictable weather patterns, and the harshest conditions imaginable. But humanity had adapted. They had learned to live, to thrive, and more importantly, to fight. And it was because of this very ability to survive and fight that Jack was so determined to use the very thing the aliens feared most: the planet's savage beasts, the dragons. Years ago, Jack had heard whispers of these beasts, massive creatures with scales like armor and claws that could tear through steel. Dragons that roamed the high mountains, hiding from the humans below. Few had ever seen them, and even fewer had survived an encounter. The stories had always fascinated Jack. As a child, he had dreamt of one day encountering such a creature, but he never imagined it would be under these circumstances. Now, with the aliens invading his home and his fellow humans fighting for survival, Jack realized that his knowledge of the terrain and the beasts of the world might be their only hope. He moved with purpose, despite the pain in his leg. Each step was slower than the last, but his determination never wavered. He knew what he had to do. His mind kept running over the memories of the old maps he had studied, the old stories shared by the elders of his village. He knew the way to the heart of the mountain range, where the dragons were said to make their nests. The aliens, meanwhile, were making short work of the town. Their soldiers had started systematically eliminating anything that posed a threat, and humans who tried to fight back were met with overwhelming force. But it was when they reached the central square that things started to take a strange turn. A group of alien soldiers came across a local weapons cache. There they found a strange assortment of makeshift weapons, old rifles, knives, and explosives that humans had managed to scavenge and construct. At first, the aliens were confused. This was nothing like the advanced, precise weaponry they were used to. They smirked at the pitiful collection of tools before them, unaware that the human spirit and ingenuity were more dangerous than they had ever realized. As they began to move on, a sharp screeching sound filled the air. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, but then it grew louder, reverberating through the ground like thunder. The soldiers froze. They had no idea what it was. The sound was primal, fierce, and unlike anything they'd ever encountered. The aliens' eyes darted to the sky, their weapons raised, ready to fire. But the source of the sound wasn't in the sky at all. It was coming from the mountains, far beyond their reach, deep in the jagged peaks of Gendera. The dragons were waking. Jack Carter had reached the base of the mountain now, the roar of the beasts growing louder with each passing second. His heart raced with anticipation. He was risking everything for this. His life, his injury, the lives of his fellow humans. It all came down to this. He had learned long ago that Gendera's creatures weren't just mindless beasts. They were predators, yes, but they were also intelligent in their own right. They were survivors, just like humanity. And just like humanity, they had instincts, senses that could be triggered in the right way. Jack knew that if he could reach them, if he could make the dragons aware of the threat, they would fight back. The humans and the dragons had always shared a distant, unspoken respect for each other. They would recognize each other's strength. Jack reached a hidden entrance in the side of the mountain. The ground trembled beneath his feet. He could feel the dragons stirring, their massive bodies shifting in their caves. He took a deep breath and began to climb. Meanwhile, the aliens in the town were still trying to make sense of the strange, unsettling sounds coming from the mountains. The atmosphere had changed, and the aliens could feel it. Something was off. They had conquered countless worlds, but none had ever been this unpredictable. They didn't know it yet, but their overconfidence was about to turn into fear. For Jack, the climb was slow, his injured leg making every movement painful. But with every step, he got closer to the dragons. The sounds of battle raged behind him, but the only thing on his mind was getting to the creatures that could shift the balance of power. As he neared the summit, a fierce wind howled around him. The air was thin, and the cold bit into his exposed skin. Jack's breath came in sharp gasps, but he didn't stop. Every instinct told him to keep going. If he could reach the top, if he could get to the dragon's lair, the fate of humanity would change forever. And all the while, the alien soldiers below had no idea what was coming for them. The dragon's awakening. The wind whipped violently at Jack's face as he neared the cave entrance, the rocks around him jagged and unforgiving. Each step he took was slower than the last, the pain in his leg intensifying with every movement. The further he climbed, the more it felt as though the mountain itself was trying to throw him off. But Jack didn't have the luxury of turning back. The roar of the dragons echoed through the mountains, growing louder, almost as if they sensed his presence. He had never felt so small, yet so determined in his life. The mountain was alive with the sound of distant thunder. He knew the dragons were out there, somewhere, waiting. He wasn't sure how long it would take for the creatures to notice him, but he had to believe they would. Humanity's last hope rested on his ability to trigger their ancient instincts. As he rounded a sharp corner, a low growl vibrated through the air. Jack froze. It wasn't the sound of a distant dragon. This was closer, much closer. Slowly, cautiously, he looked up. There, towering over him on a ledge just above, was the first dragon. Its massive form was covered in dark, stone-like scales that shimmered even in the pale light of the dying day. The creature's wings were folded against its sides, and its massive tail curled behind it like a weapon of destruction. Its eyes, yellow and intense, bore down on Jack with a predatory gaze. The dragon's nostrils flared as it sniffed the air, catching the scent of human blood. Jack's heart raced in his chest. He could feel the ground rumble beneath him, the very mountain trembling as if it knew what was about to happen. The dragon's lips curled slightly, revealing a set of sharp, jagged teeth. It was a magnificent creature, yet terrifying. And in that moment, Jack realized just how deeply he had underestimated the creatures he was dealing with. But he didn't hesitate. His gaze remained steady, never wavering from the dragon. He couldn't afford fear. Not now. For a moment, there was only silence. Jack could hear nothing except for his own heartbeat in his ears and the dragon's slow breathing. The air was thick with tension. Then, without warning, the creature opened its mouth and let out a deafening roar that echoed across the mountainside. It was the same primal sound Jack had heard earlier. Its reverberations filled the air with a force that seemed to shake the ground itself. But this time, it wasn't a call to other dragons. It was a warning, a challenge. The dragon stepped forward, its claws scraping against the rocks, and Jack instinctively reached for the weapon at his side, a broken rifle he had scavenged from the battlefield. But he didn't raise it. He knew it wouldn't do him any good against such a creature. Instead, he did something unexpected. He spoke. "Help me, and I'll make sure you never go hungry again," he said, his voice hoarse from the climb and the effort. The dragon paused, its head tilting slightly to one side, as though considering the words. It studied Jack, the human standing before it, injured, vulnerable, and seemingly insignificant compared to the vast power of the creature. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make the dragon understand. The creatures were fierce, yes, but they were survivors. They lived in a world where strength mattered, but so did intelligence and cunning. Jack wasn't just trying to appeal to their hunger for battle or power. He was trying to make them see that a partnership with humanity could be a new kind of survival. "Fight with us. Fight the invaders, and we will feed you," Jack continued, speaking more confidently now, feeling a strange connection with the creature. It was an odd alliance to form, but desperation made people do strange things. The dragon didn't immediately attack. Instead, it stepped closer to Jack, until its enormous face was just inches away from his. Jack could feel the heat from its body, the scorching temperature radiating from its scales. His breath hitched, but he didn't move. Then something extraordinary happened. The dragon lowered its head slowly, as if considering Jack's words, and to his shock, it did something that seemed almost like a nod, its massive armored head dipping down ever so slightly in recognition. A low, rumbling sound escaped the dragon's throat. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was a sound of understanding. Jack's breath caught in his chest. He had done it. The dragon was listening. At that moment, something inside Jack clicked. He knew it wasn't just him that had to survive. It was humanity. And if he could unite with the dragons, together they could drive the alien invaders from their home. This was bigger than him. This was for everyone. But just as the dragon took a step back, a loud crack echoed through the sky, the sound of a blast from the alien forces. Jack looked down the mountain to see a plume of smoke rising into the sky, signaling that the aliens had launched a new assault on the human settlement. The time for words was over. The dragons had to act now. With one final roar that rattled the very air around them, the dragon spread its wings. The massive, leathery wings stretched wide, casting a shadow over Jack. The creature's claws scraped the rocks as it lifted off the ground, soaring into the air. Jack could only watch in awe as the dragon ascended into the sky, its form quickly blending with the darkness of the approaching night. There was no time to waste. The battle had already begun, and with the dragons now joining the fight, Jack knew that the tide was about to turn. The dragon's wrath. The sky was painted in hues of crimson and orange as the sun dipped behind the mountain peaks. The hum of distant alien ships could be heard in the air, their engines whining like angry bees. The war had begun in full force. But Jack wasn't looking up at the sky or listening to the alien drones. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the dragons had gone. He was on the edge of a cliff, the wind tearing at his clothes as he scanned the valley below. The air smelled of sulfur and burnt ozone, the result of the alien bombardment on the human settlement. He knew the time was close. The dragons would strike at any moment. Then he saw it. A flash of movement in the distance, a shadow darker than the evening sky, gliding across the valley like a falling star. A dragon. It was a large one, its wings beating the air with such force that the ground beneath Jack seemed to tremble. The dragon was on the hunt, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, another shape appeared, then another. The air was thick with the beating of wings, and the distant roar of the dragons filled the air. Each dragon, massive and fierce, made its presence known. They were coming for the aliens, and they weren't alone either. Jack's communicator buzzed in his ear. It was a message from his unit. "Jack, are you seeing this?" The voice crackled. It was Commander Harris, his superior. "The dragons. They're attacking the invaders. We're getting reports of dragons tearing through the alien forces, wiping out entire squads of soldiers." A smile crossed Jack's lips, but there was no time for celebration. The battle wasn't won yet. The aliens would respond, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. "Tell everyone to be ready," Jack replied, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning." The roar of the dragons grew louder as they dove into the fray. They were swift, like shadows in the dark, tearing through the skies and launching themselves at the alien ships below. Their claws ripped through the metal like paper, and their fiery breath left scorched earth in its wake. It was chaos. The dragons were relentless. From his vantage point, Jack could see the alien ships descending in droves, but the dragons didn't retreat. They attacked in waves, biting and clawing at the alien ships, their scales glinting in the light of the explosions. The air smelled of burning fuel, and the ground shook with each impact as the dragons rained destruction down on the invaders. Jack's communicator buzzed again. It was Harris, his voice filled with excitement and disbelief. "You won't believe this, Jack, but they're retreating. The aliens are actually retreating. The dragons are driving them out of the air." Jack couldn't help but laugh, a deep, bitter laugh. He'd been on the front lines for months, facing the relentless alien onslaught. To hear this now, after everything they had suffered, was almost too good to be true. The dragons were real. They were a force that no alien army had ever expected. But Jack knew it wasn't over. The alien forces were powerful, and they would regroup. But now, they were no longer just facing human soldiers. They were facing something far more terrifying. The dragons. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the sounds of the battle below, the rumbling of the dragons' roars mixing with the sound of alien gunfire. But despite the chaos, Jack felt a strange sense of calm. He wasn't alone anymore. Humanity had found its true allies. And together, they were unstoppable. As the last of the alien ships fell from the sky, Jack turned and began to descend from the cliff. His legs still throbbed, but he hardly noticed it anymore. There was no time for pain. His people were safe, for now. And the dragons had shown them what real power looked like. When he reached the bottom of the cliff, Jack saw the first signs of the dragons returning. Their massive wings beat the air, their powerful forms silhouetted against the burning sky. They were triumphant, but there was no time to celebrate. Jack knew that the aliens wouldn't give up so easily. But as he looked out over the battlefield, he realized that the tide had turned. Humanity, with the help of the dragons, had struck a blow that the invaders would never forget. And it was only the beginning. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Jack allowed himself a moment to savor the victory. But only for a moment. There was still much work to do. The battle was far from over. And now, with the dragons by their side, humanity had a chance to win. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. The true war was still ahead. The betrayal within. The night sky hung heavy over the battlefield, the stars barely visible through the thick smoke rising from the remnants of the alien ships. The roar of the dragons had finally quieted, their wings stilling as they perched on the ruins, their eyes glowing in the dark like embers. The alien forces had been pushed back, but Jack knew the fight was far from over. The victory felt hollow fleeting. Jack limped through the camp, his legs still aching from the battle, his mind racing. The dragons had helped them win, yes. But there was something else, a feeling, gnawing at him like a persistent shadow. He wasn't the only one who had noticed the strange behavior of the aliens, and the humans weren't without their own secrets either. In the tent near the command center, Jack found Commander Harris hunched over a map, his face shadowed with worry. He didn't even look up as Jack entered. "Jack," Harris muttered, his voice low. "I was hoping you wouldn't come back here. I wanted to discuss something sensitive." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" Harris looked up, his face grim. "It's not the aliens we should be worried about right now. It's us. One of our own has been leaking information to the enemy." The words hit Jack like a slap. He blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. "What are you talking about?" "Someone within our ranks is working with the aliens. They're feeding them information about our plans, our movements, everything. It's how they knew about the dragons before we even discovered them." Harris's voice was tight with frustration. "The aliens have been one step ahead because of this traitor." Jack's heart sank. A traitor among them. He thought about the soldiers he had fought alongside for months, the men and women who had shared the same blood, sweat, and tears. It didn't make sense. "Who?" Jack asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Harris replied. "But we have to find out. Quickly. The aliens might be regrouping as we speak, and we need to know what they're planning. If this goes on for much longer, we'll be back to square one." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. He had been through hell to get this far, and now they had a traitor in their midst. His blood boiled at the thought of someone sabotaging everything they had fought for. But there was something else gnawing at him, a suspicion, a whisper in the back of his mind. Could it be someone he trusted? Could it be one of the leaders, someone who had a hand in getting the dragons to fight alongside humanity? Jack turned away from Harris, his mind spinning. The dragons had been an unexpected ally. They had fought with a fury that shook the heavens, but now Jack wondered if their appearance had been more than just fate. Could the dragons know more than they had let on? Was it possible that they too had their own motives, their own plans? Was there a darker force pulling the strings, something far more sinister than the alien threat? His thoughts were interrupted by a voice from behind him. A soldier stepped into the tent, his face pale and tense. "Sir, you need to see this," the soldier said urgently. Without a word, Jack followed the soldier out of the tent and into the camp. The night was alive with movement, the soldiers preparing for the next phase of the fight. But the soldier led him to a small group huddled around a screen. Jack glanced at the monitor, his stomach tightening as he saw a familiar face. It was one of the higher-ranking officers, lieutenant colonels who had worked closely with Jack in the past. His face was on the screen, but it wasn't a recorded message. The image was live, and the officer was speaking in hushed tones to someone Jack couldn't see. "We'll need to move quickly. The dragons have already begun retreating, and we don't want to risk another confrontation. We can still win this, but only if we work together," the officer said, his voice low and calculated. "Wait, that's him." Jack's voice was sharp. He recognized the officer's voice, but what he saw next nearly made his blood run cold. The officer was standing in a dark room, surrounded by alien tech. A strange device blinked in the background, and there was an alien figure beside him, one Jack had seen only in brief glimpses during previous encounters. "Who's he talking to?" Jack demanded. The soldier at the monitor quickly zoomed in on the alien figure. "I'm not sure, sir, but I've seen that symbol before. It's the same one used by the elite of the alien army." A shiver ran down Jack's spine. The pieces were falling into place. The officer was working with the aliens, and not just any aliens. He was communicating with their highest-ranking officials. Jack's anger flared. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a conspiracy. The officer wasn't acting alone. He was part of a much larger plan to undermine humanity's fight for survival. The aliens had infiltrated their ranks, and Jack had no idea how deep the deception went. "What do we do now?" the soldier asked, his voice nervous. Jack stood still for a moment, weighing the situation. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined, and the weight of it felt like a mountain on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. The next steps were crucial. "We find the traitor," Jack said, his voice cold and steady. "And we expose this before it's too late. The war isn't over, but we've got a new battle to fight, one that's much closer to home." As the soldier nodded and left to inform the others, Jack's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there were more questions than answers. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the ones who had fought beside him on the front lines. There were too many unknowns, but one thing was clear: the war was far from over, and the real enemy might be much closer than they had ever feared. The darkness of betrayal hung over them like a storm cloud, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The enemy among us. The cold, oppressive air of the war camp felt heavier than ever. The night was thick with uncertainty, and Jack could feel it closing in around him. He stood near the edge of the camp, his thoughts consumed by the unsettling discovery of the traitor. Every shadow, every whisper seemed to carry the weight of suspicion. Who could he trust now? The officer on the screen, the one who had been collaborating with the aliens, wasn't just an isolated case. The deeper Jack looked, the more he realized that the corruption had spread far beyond a single individual. The whole command structure was compromised. The more he thought about it, the more everything began to make sense. The failed missions, the mysterious supply shortages, the strange movements of troops, all were signs of deliberate sabotage. Jack had known something was off for a while. The way certain commanders had been acting, the way the dragons had suddenly appeared just in time to change the tide of the battle. It wasn't just a coincidence. The galaxy's most dangerous species, the so-called Deathworlders, weren't the only threat to humanity's survival. They had a bigger problem now: betrayal from within. "Jack, we need to talk." A voice broke through his thoughts. It was Commander Harris, looking as tense as Jack had ever seen him. Jack turned and gave him a curt nod. "What's the word?" Harris's eyes darted around, making sure no one else was listening before leaning in. "I'd just been given a report from one of our scouts. They spotted an entire unit of alien soldiers, but there's something strange about the way they're moving. They're not attacking. They're retreating." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Retreating? Why?" "That's the thing," Harris continued. "It doesn't add up. The aliens are on the run, but we know they have no reason to retreat. If anything, they should be pushing us harder, not pulling back. Something's off, and I think this might be tied to the traitor." Jack rubbed his jaw, deep in thought. It wasn't like the enemy to retreat without a clear reason, especially with their superior numbers and technology. He'd suspected that the traitor had more to do with the aliens' actions than just giving them information about troop movements. But this was different. The retreat meant they were playing a game with them, a game Jack hadn't even begun to understand. "They're luring us into a trap," Jack said quietly. Harris looked at him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "The alien retreat isn't about running away," Jack explained, his voice hardening. "It's about drawing us out. They want us to follow them. They want us to think we're winning, then hit us with a surprise counterattack. We can't fall for it." Harris nodded slowly. "You think the traitor is involved in this somehow?" "Unsure of it," Jack said. "They're using him or her to guide us straight into the trap. Whoever it is, they've been giving the aliens the advantage for far too long. But we're not going to let them win. We'll turn the tables." Harris's face hardened. "We'll have to move fast. If we don't act now, we might be walking straight into a massacre." Jack clenched his fists, the anger surging through him again. He had already seen what the aliens were capable of. But this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was about revealing the traitor and exposing the enemy within their own ranks. "There's one thing we can do," Jack said, his voice low with determination. "We need to take control of this situation before the aliens have the chance to regroup. We need to force them into a confrontation and make them show their cards." Harris raised an eyebrow. "How?" "We hit them hard. We move on the retreating forces, make it look like we're following their lead. But we'll have a backup force in place, hidden, waiting for the right moment to strike. We'll draw the traitor out, and when they show themselves, we'll stop them in their tracks." Harris nodded, his resolve firming. "Let's get the teams together." Jack turned to leave, but before he did, he paused. "And Harris, make sure no one knows what we're doing. I don't want the traitor tipping them off." "Understood," Harris said with a grim look. "We're in this together, all the way." Jack nodded, but the weight of the mission felt heavier than ever. They weren't just fighting the aliens anymore. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against an external enemy, and the other against an internal betrayal that threatened to tear them apart. As Jack walked through the camp, the soldiers moving around him seemed unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The warriors they had fought alongside, the allies who had shared blood and sweat with them, could be the very ones who would betray them at the crucial moment. It was a bitter thought, but one Jack couldn't afford to ignore. His eyes scanned the camp, looking for any signs of suspicious behavior. The traitor could be anyone, and there was no time to waste. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of distant alien activity. The enemy was regrouping, but they weren't ready for what Jack had in store. He wasn't about to let them win, not without a fight. And as for the traitor, whoever they were, they would be exposed. Jack would make sure of it. The final confrontation. The war was far from over. With the alien forces retreating, it was clear that something deeper was at play. But Jack's instincts told him it was only the calm before the storm. The traitor's identity still eluded him, but the pieces were beginning to fit together. It was only a matter of time before everything came to light. But there was no more time to waste. The mission had become personal. Jack stood at the edge of the command tent, his mind focused on the battle to come. The ground shook under the weight of the alien retreat, but it wasn't a full withdrawal. No, the aliens were gathering. They were planning their final move. This would be the moment that decided everything. Harris stood by Jack's side, a grim look on his face as he glanced at the map in his hands. "We have to move fast. The aliens are pulling their last forces together. If we don't take them out now, they'll regroup and hit us with everything they've got." Jack nodded. He knew the stakes. If they failed, it wouldn't just be the end for humanity. It would be the end for every living being who had ever fought beside them. The future of the galaxy was hanging in the balance. "We've got one chance to end this," Jack said, his voice firm. "I'm going after the traitor. You lead the charge against the aliens. Don't let them regroup." Harris looked him in the eye. "Are you sure you want to do this alone? We can take them together." Jack shook his head. "The traitor has to be stopped. I'll do whatever it takes. You handle the aliens. I'll deal with the rest." The commander didn't protest. He knew what Jack was capable of, and he knew the stakes. They had both made their sacrifices, but this was something Jack had to face on his own. As Jack turned away, heading toward the heart of the enemy's camp, he felt the weight of the mission on his shoulders. But there was something else, something more powerful than the fear, the uncertainty, and the darkness. It was the anger, the betrayal, the knowledge that someone among them had been working against them all along, and Jack would be the one to bring them down. The night was thick with tension as Jack moved through the alien camp, his boots silent on the rocky ground. He kept to the shadows, staying out of sight, knowing that if he was discovered, the mission would fail. The enemy was watching. They knew something was wrong, and they were ready to strike. Then he saw them. The figure he had been searching for, the one who had been sabotaging their every move. The traitor. They stood at the center of the camp, talking with an alien officer, their voice low, but unmistakably calm. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, and his hand instinctively tightened around the handle of his weapon. He was close. Jack could feel his pulse quicken as the traitor turned and began to walk toward him, unaware of his presence. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had waited for this moment too long. He didn't need to ask questions. He didn't need to hear their reasoning. All he needed was to stop them before they did any more damage. With a swift motion, Jack stepped forward, and in one fluid motion, he incapacitated the traitor, silencing them before they could even react. The alien officer turned just in time to see the betrayal laid bare, but before they could raise their weapon, Jack was on them, taking them out in a blur of motion. The traitor, now unconscious, lay on the ground, and Jack's chest heaved with the weight of the moment. But it wasn't over. He still had a job to do. The sounds of battle were growing louder in the distance, a reminder that the alien forces were closing in. Jack wasted no time. He quickly checked the traitor's communications device, hoping to find any information about the aliens' next move. And then he found it. A hidden message, one that revealed the true scope of the enemy's plans. The aliens weren't just retreating. They were regrouping to launch a final strike, an all-out assault on the heart of humanity's stronghold. Jack's stomach churned with the realization. The traitor had been feeding them false intelligence, leading them straight into the enemy's trap. But now, with the truth in his hands, Jack had the upper hand. He tapped into the comm system, sending an urgent message to Harris and the rest of the human forces. The enemy was coming for them, hard and fast, but Jack was going to make sure they weren't ready for what was about to hit them. Harris, Jack said into the comms, his voice calm but resolute, "Get ready. The aliens are preparing for a final assault. We've got one shot to stop them." Harris's voice crackled back through the comms. "We're ready, Jack. We've got your back. Just tell us where to strike." Jack smiled, a grim, determined smile. "Hit them with everything you've got. We're going to make sure they never forget what happens when they mess with humanity." With the traitor neutralized, the plans now in place, Jack raced back to the front lines, knowing that this was the final push, the moment that would determine everything. This time, there would be no retreat. The aliens would learn what it meant to face the full wrath of humanity, and Jack, more than anyone, was ready to deliver that lesson. The battle was about to begin, and there would be no mercy.